Randolph loved backpacking. He loved going to different countries with nothing but a huge backpack, money, and a thirst for seeing the world. He had backpacked through Vietnam and Thailand, walked from Germany to France, and even spent a weekend in London. One day, Randolph announced that he was going to Italy. This has been a dream of his ever since he was a kid. He had always dreamed of going to Italy and experiencing what he called authentic pasta and pizza. So, he packed his bag, saved a hefty budget, and took the early plane to Italy. Just being in the city of Italy was something beyond Randolph's imagination. He saw the beautifully carved statues and architecture, and if that wasn't enough, the taste of authentic Italian cuisine was perfect. As he walked around the city, he began to notice the clouds were getting darker and water slowly dripping to the ground. He then realized that it was rain, and if there was one thing he had forgotten, it was to find the nearest hostel to stay at. What's worse, his phone was low on battery, and the spare power banks he had were low on battery as well. Randolph needed to find a place to stay for the night, so he began to walk along the streets of Italy to find the nearest hostel for the night. But because he had no idea where he was headed, he had a hard time finding one. And while his Italian was all right, it was hard to speak to some of the locals if he didn't know the name of the hostel. He was almost ready to throw in the towel and sleep in one of the train stations when he was approached by a man. The man looked to be dignified and well-dressed. "Hello there," he said, speaking with a heavy Italian accent. "You are not from around here, sir?" Randolph nodded his head. The man continued, "My mistress houses travelers for the night. Would you be interested?" "All right," Randolph said. The man then led Randolph to a car that was parked to the side. Randolph saw that the car was a vintage model. As they drove along, the man introduced himself as Luca and that his employer, Signora Franca, was a well-known socialite who enjoyed listening to stories from travelers. Randolph felt a bit calm and somehow relaxed after hearing that statement. They soon arrived at a large white house in the middle of the piazza. It had huge marble columns and large stone motifs like flowers and festoons all over the wall. The doors were made up of 2 massive oak panels. Luca then led Randolph to the main door and escorted him inside. Signora Franca was a woman who looked to be in her late 60s and was dressed in elegant black. She had pearls all over her person and something of a turban on her head. She welcomed Randolph and began to chat with him while Luca prepared his sleeping quarters. "Thank you so much for allowing me to stay," Randolph said. "I forgot the name of the hostel I was supposed to stay and my phone battery was getting low." "It's no problem," Signora Franca said in a very dignified voice. "So Luca tells me you are a traveler. Whereabouts are you headed, Signor?" "I'm just exploring Italy," Randolph said. "Nowhere in particular." After having dinner, Randolph was shown his room, and after thanking Signora Franca, he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, he woke up and after a delicious breakfast, thanked Signora Franca once more and headed out of the White House into the streets of Italy to continue his trek. Around midday, he was able to find the hostel he initially booked and checked in. He then thought of visiting Signora Franca, so he walked to where the White House was. Upon approaching the piazza, he saw to his astonishment that the White House was nowhere to be found. In fact, where the White House had been was now an empty lot. He then noticed a man and walked up to him. "Excuse me, what happened to the White House there?" The man looked at him with a confused look. "Pardon?" he asked. "I stayed in the White House that was in between those 2 buildings, and now it's gone." He pointed to the empty lot. "Signor, there is no house there," the man said. "There used to be a White House, but it hasn't been around for decades." Randolph would then learn from the man that Signora Franca was a socialite back in 1938. While she was a regular at most parties, She was also known to have aided several Jewish families and hid them in her home, which was known as the White House because of its pure white facade. However, on August 13, 1943, the city was bombed by Allied forces, and every building, including the White House, had been hit. Signora Franca and her staff did not survive. It's been said that many people claim to have been invited into the White House whenever they need a place to stay and were accommodated by the generous and elegant mistress of the house. When they leave the house and intend to return, it's nowhere to be found. I used to love the outdoors. Growing up, I would take every opportunity I had to go hiking, or if my parents would allow it, camping with my friends and their parents. I don't do either of those things anymore. My last camping trip with my family was when I was 16. It was summer, and to celebrate the end of another tumultuous school year, my dad decided to treat me to a camping trip, while also dragging my significantly less enthusiastic mom along for the ride. I'll be honest, I had my doubts from the very start. Neither of my parents were very knowledgeable about the outdoors. They spent most of their time working in the city, and most of the hiking and camping trips I'd gone on before had been done with my best friend and his significantly more outdoorsy parents. My parents were both smart people, but they weren't really all that knowledgeable about the outdoors. But my parents being, well, my parents, they tended to think they know what was best for me, even though they're objectively wrong. That's the way with most parents, I suppose. I might have been way younger than them, but even I knew back then that I was probably more experienced in these sorts of things. I was worried they would ignore something important at some point. My concerns would be proven to be completely warranted by the end of our trip. The first few nights of camping went fine. My mom complained about most of the time, either about the mosquitoes or how hard the sleeping bags my dad bought were. But all things considered, things were going pretty great. I got to bask in the outdoors like I wanted while sharing my love for it with my parents. Then, on the third day, we came across something on the path that changed my life forever. We were hiking up a small mountain when we came across a couple of brown bear cubs a little ways away from the hiking trail. I'm no bear expert, but even I could tell that they were not even half a year old yet. Of course, they were adorable, and of course, my parents were enamored by the sight of them. But while they were busy taking pictures of them on their phones, I was eternally panicking. I pleaded for them to stop laughing around and get back to quickly walking the trail. I'd watched countless hiking safety videos on preparation for the trip. The most dangerous animal every single one of them warned against were bears, especially mother bears with their cubs. I tried to tell my parents that all mother bears raise and protect their cubs by themselves, and during that time would be far more aggressive towards other animals than they would be normally. Predictably enough, they didn't listen. My dad even trudged off the trail and tried to pet one of the bear cubs. The little bear cub let out a small yawn, apparently pleased at being pet, and my dad kept petting them, thinking that nothing was wrong because nothing had happened to him yet. My mother stood nearby taking pictures. Afterwards, she just stood there like a sitting duck for what must have been 5 minutes, looking through filters to put on the picture. My ignored concerns were proven painfully valid. The mother bear returned. She had just finished hunting for food, and upon seeing the two humans near her cub, she flew into a blind rage and charged at them. I was able to notice the mother bear charging towards us in time to warn them, but my warnings fell on deaf ears just as before. The mother bear pounced on my father and tore open his throat with a single bite. Then it turned to my horrified mother and mauled her face with a single swing of its gigantic paw, whilst it continued to savage my parents as they screamed in agony. I dropped to the ground, not a moment too soon either. The second my back hit the dirt, My body froze up in shock and fear. The bears were brown, and I remember the adage for dealing with bears. If it's black, fight back. If it's brown, get on the ground. I stay there on the ground as the bears sniffed at my sweating body. Seconds later, it moved on to tear into the corpses of my parents. It must have thought my scrawny teenage body wasn't enough sustenance to be worth mauling. I forced myself to stay silent the entire time it ate my parents' corpse only a few feet away from me. A park ranger found me passed out on that exact same spot hours later. I told him everything that happened. The whole thing was written off as a tragedy, and an unavoidable one at that. I live with my best friend and his parents now. Although they've tried multiple times to get me back into camping, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the forest again. My cousin Rhea is a self-proclaimed foodie. She loves food and loves tasting exotic cuisine. She also enjoys traveling, so much so that she created a blog called Wonder Foodie. I totally support my cousin, so I was surprised to learn that 3 weeks ago, she stopped posting. I called her over to my place and asked her what happened. She said she didn't feel like doing it anymore, ever since her last trip to Canada. I asked her again, and this is what she said. Rhea had decided to go on a road trip to a famous resort town, which was basically an 8-hour trip by land. Normally, a plane ride would lessen the travel time by 6 hours, but Rhea wanted to try the scenic route. She was only 2 hours away from the resort town when she suddenly felt tired and hungry. After all, it had been nearly 6 hours since her last meal, and she was feeling quite hungry. She drove on, but couldn't find a diner or a roadside restaurant, and she had already finished all of her takeout meals. She suddenly saw a roadside diner. She parked the car in the parking lot. She was quick to note that there were lots of cars and trucks parked as well. She then went inside the diner. The interior was a quintessential 1970s diner, complete with leather booth seats, formica tables, a long counter, and several bar stools. She was also quick to note that there weren't that many customers inside. She counted at least 5 to 7 customers. She took a seat on the counter where a waitress approached her. "Hello there," she said. "Welcome to our little diner. Can I interest you in our chef's special?" Chef's special? That piqued my cousin's interest. "What's the chef's special?" my cousin asked. The waitress replied, "Barbecue ribs with a pound burger, boiled potatoes, and meatballs." So she orders the chef's special. 10 minutes later, it arrived and was presented to her in all its glorious splendor. My cousin didn't even bother to take a photo of it like she normally did. She just went on to help herself. It was the most delicious thing she ever tasted, so she says. She then called the waitress over. "This is the best ribs I've ever tasted," she would say. "What's your secret? Is it the sauce? You must have put in some really good herbs, huh?" "The secret," the waitress would say, "is in the ingredients. Would you like seconds?" Normally, my cousin would always have seconds, especially if the meal she's had is delicious. This time, my cousin turned it down. Apparently, the chef's special was too good that it made her full. She then glanced at her phone. She hadn't realized that it was already 4 p.m. She immediately asked for the bill. The waitress seemed to be taking her sweet time in providing the bill, but my cousin paid for the special nevertheless. After she was done paying, she got up and left the diner. The waitress waved a friendly goodbye. "Thanks for coming. Come back soon." She had an eerie yet friendly smile on her face as she said so. She arrived at the town by 6 p.m. just as the sun was setting. She then went into the hotel she checked in at. The front desk then asked, "Miss Rhea, we were worried you wouldn't make it in time for your check-in. Was it hard to find the town?" "Oh, no," Rhea replied. "I just happened to stop by at a quaint diner just a few miles away. I was having a late lunch and lost track of the time. The front desk manager and her assistant looked at each other and then at Ria. A diner? Where? It was in town before this. The 1970s American one, the one with the nearby gas station, she said. She suddenly noticed how their eyes widened with fear and worry. Why? Miss Ria, the manager started. Did you see a lot of cars in the parking lot? Yes, but there were very few customers, so I assumed... Miss Ria, you are a very lucky woman, the manager finished. A lot of tourists and travelers would disappear when they passed the part of the road. Those cars you saw, they belong to so many tourists and travelers who have disappeared over the years. But I saw some customers there, and they looked like they just arrived, she said. Did they leave as well? The manager asked. When Ria shook her head, the manager let out a sad sigh. Poor souls. Why? Ria asked. What's wrong? Why do you say that? This is where Ria leans forward towards me to tell me exactly what the manager said. And what the manager said, and even I couldn't believe it, was something straight out of an urban legend come true. The story goes that if travelers approach a lone diner, they are greeted by friendly staff members. They are given the chef's special, and because it's so delicious, they ask for a second helping and stay further on until it's dark. And when that happens, the staff kill them. Ria then asked, what happens to the bodies? Those bodies become ingredients for the chef's special, he grimly said.